Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the latest episode of Digital Adoption Show, where we host top L&D, HR, and tech luminaries and talk about what's next in the future of work and tech. I'm your host, Akanksha Singh, Senior Manager Customer Success at Whatfix. Today, we are going to answer the question, are you measuring your learning impact correctly? This will be your masterclass filled with great tips and tricks to efficiently and effectively measure learning impact. We are thrilled to welcome a very special guest who is on a mission to redefine the way we think about learning. Joining us today is Dr. Alaina Szlachta, a distinguished learning architect with over 15 years of experience in the knowledge industry. Alena's impressive career spans roles such as adjunct professor, corporate trainer, curriculum writer, instructional designer, program manager, evaluation specialist, and research associate. Alaina is passionate about transforming learning from information sharing to a powerful tool for real change. She believes that hyper focused information sharing leads to dull, on demand courses with low completion rate and passive content consumption, where participants are left to DIY their own transformation. Alaina, welcome to the show. Your approach to learning is truly inspiring, and I'm excited to dive deeper into your thoughts and experiences. Before we start our discussion, why don't you start by sharing a bit about your background and what inspired you to focus on measuring the impact of learning? Also, we would love to know a passion of yours outside of work, particularly close to your heart.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Akanksha, for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, my background, in a very brief nutshell, I am a true practitioner. I started out as a teacher. I fell in love with teaching actually when I was in Mexico. I finished my undergraduate degree, decided to move to Mexico just to have another experience. And I started doing English as a foreign language instruction. And I had to make my own curriculum. I showed up in classrooms with people of all different backgrounds with a common goal of trying to master the English language to then improve their job opportunities and their lives. And I just literally fell in love with the experience of helping people through teaching and learning. And that was what launched not only my master's and doctorate degree, but also all of the different places that I've taught, I've written, I've evaluated and researched. And that's really what's led me to where I am today.
That's so interesting to learn, Elena. So, next, we have a quick rapid fire round with three quirky questions, which we proudly call as triple strike. So, are you ready to be triple strike, Elena?
Yes, go for it.
So, question number one, if you could instantly learn any skill or subject, what would it be and why?
Okay, so back to the story of me moving to Mexico in my early 20s. I never officially mastered the Spanish language. And I have many friends in my life, important people in my life who are fluent Spanish speakers. I am still not a fluent Spanish speaker. So if I could just wave a magic wand, I would get this and it would save me the pain of 20 years of trying to master something and still not being able to do it. I apparently am great at data and numbers and working with people, but languages apparently is just not my strong suit. So give me that skill if you could have the power.
Spanish, I would love that too, for sure. If you could switch lives with a famous CEO for a day, who would it be and what fun twist would you add to their company?
Okay, so this answer is going to be a little cheeky because I literally can't think of anyone else's life that I would want more than my own. I am a CEO of
Ooh,
my own business and I'm really enjoying the journey of being a small business owner and all of the nuances that come along with starting a business, nurturing it, and continuing to be viable in the world of business and learning and development. So I wouldn't want to switch places with anybody. I'm happy right where I am.
that's so sweet. I love it. Question number three, would you choose the power to fly or the power to breathe underwater? And what would you be the first thing you do with it?
Okay, this is an easy one. I absolutely would want to fly. And the reason being that my family is all over the world, not exactly where I am in Austin, Texas. And so I would love to be able to fly. And the first thing I would do is fly over to where my family is and surprise them
Oh,
for dinner.
Oh my God, that's so sweet. Yeah, me too, for sure. I would love to fly too.
Yeah.
So those were some really fun answers, Alina. Really amazed by your thoughts. Now let's move to the real bit of our podcast, the serious bit, if I may. So shall we start?
Yeah.
All right. So question number one. What are some common misconceptions about measuring learning programs that organizations need to overcome?
So I want to answer your question with a question to you. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
So, what do you imagine is the reason that we measure in the first place? Just what are the first things that come to mind for you?
it, it would help any organization to track their success, to know if, if they are able to meet their goals and if they are on the right path or not. So that is what I would imagine it would be.
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, we measure to know if we're being effective and ultimately to improve the effectiveness of whatever it is that we're doing. And so,
Right.
one of the biggest misconceptions is the focus on learning objectives and not business or organizational or performance objectives.
Yeah.
And I think that hyper focus on learning keeps us in the realm of learning, which is about completion rates and how satisfied people are with the learning experience and how effective the learning program was. In fact, I had a member of my community of practice ask me, how would you evaluate the effectiveness of our content? And I said, I wouldn't, because the
Yeah.
content and the program is just a tool that is meant to foster change and growth in some more important thing outside of learning. Usually that's behavior change or it is some kind of important business goal that we're looking to improve through learning. So I would say the first thing is that the misconception of hyper focus on learning objectives and all the measurement that comes along with that, where instead we should be really drilling down on what do we want the learning to do for the organization and for its people. And I think that will help us to shift our mindset to focus on the right things versus maybe the easier things. And I know that you represent a technology platform and there are many other tech platforms out there. And of course, the easiest thing for technology to do is to help us measure completion rates, satisfaction, maybe even some knowledge checks, maybe even some skill development. But the real value comes in the form of changes in performance and then what happens in the
Yeah.
business because of it. So I
Yes.
really encourage folks, don't spend so much time on the learning objective, really spend more time on the so what? What do we want learning to do for our people and for the business or the organizations that we support? And I think that would make a world of difference if we shifted that mindset. And then on the flip side, the ROI. So I think on the one hand, we are hyper
Yeah.
focused on learning objectives. And then on the other hand, we're hyper focused on ROI. And I don't believe ROI is bad, but I don't believe the ultimate goal of measurement is to get the ROI or the return on investment of learning. Really, our goals are exactly what you said. Were we effective?
Yeah.
Did we accomplish the goals? And the ROI isn't necessarily going to tell us if we accomplished our goals or not. It's just a number.
Okay.
It just tells
Yes.
us how much money per se did we, give to the business because we invested in training and learning. That's important, but it's not necessarily going to tell us if we accomplished our goals, which could look a myriad of different ways.
Yeah. And Elena, being in customer success, I cannot agree more with this. This is absolutely spot on. Measuring the business impact is the most important thing that you can do for any of your initiatives. So, Elena, you mentioned that many commonly used metrics and learning can be. How can organizations ensure they measure the right thing? Are there any tools or technologies you recommend for tracking and analyzing learning impact?
So, yes. And I want to tell you the process that I would use and suggest our listeners use to figure out what they should be measuring. We obviously want some of those vanity metrics that you commonly get, and whatever learning management or learning experience platform you've adopted, they will all give you completion rates and they'll all
Yeah.
give you things like the input, like the amount of time somebody spent watching a video. They might allow you to upload assignments that are part of the learning experience. Those are important. We want to be able to see that people are completing the program because, of course, if they're not, well, nothing else is possible. So obviously, people do need to be engaging in the opportunities we've created for them. But what's more important is figuring out, is the program, the initiative, or the experience of learning that we're providing, is it, to your point earlier, is it fostering the goals that we seek? And so there are three questions that I think are really important and help us pinpoint appropriate metrics in addition to those more vanity metrics of satisfaction, completion, and inputs. So here they are.
Yeah.
Question number one: what's the change that you expect to see after people have completed the program? And that's open ended. There's not going to be a standard or a consistent expectation. It's really truly about, well, what's the change that this program is meant to bring about? And in answering that question, you'll likely come to some clarity around things that you could measure. And I have an example, but I want to give you the questions first. So, question number two: what's the problem that this initiative is meant to solve? And that might be the same answer as the change. It might be, but that will
Yeah.
also give you some ideas around things you could be measuring. And lastly, and this one I think is the most overlooked, and that is, what does the performance that we expect people to be doing after training, what does that look like operationally? Like, think of the fly on the wall. If I was watching somebody do the performance, what would I be seeing? And that helps us to create certain measures of what we could be evaluating after and during the training initiative. So, do you want me to give an example to maybe put this all together?
Yes, absolutely.
So, I host a community of practice or a meetup group, however you want to talk about it. And so, we actually practiced what I call, how do you measure that? And so the
Yes.
group agreed that they wanted to practice measuring behavior change. And one of the group members was like, hey, I have a time blocking initiative that I'm teaching people about time blocking. And I like this example because it's like really small and specific. And most of us kind of understand what time blocking is. So, time blocking is the initiative. So, what's the change? And of course, I'm sort of giving you an example. The change could look a lot of different ways. But I think we might all agree that one of the changes that would come about if people are time blocking more consistently is that they'd be more productive. The idea is that if people can organize and manage their time through the tool and practice of time blocking, that they would then be doing things more efficiently and we'd have more productivity. So, in answering that question, we have one metric already. The other thing that I think could change, again, this as an example, is that people have more clarity on what they're supposed to accomplish week over week. Because if you're time blocked, you're literally sitting down, you're looking at your calendar. Well, what do you block on your calendar? Probably those things that are most important for you to complete week over week. So I imagine that another change could be that people have more clarity on what they need to be doing every week, more clarity on their goals. So those are two really easy things for us to measure along with the time blocking initiative. The other thing, the problem. So I imagine that one of the problems that is leading us to want a time blocking initiative is that people might have burnout or low morale. They're so stressed out because they're not getting stuff done. Managers are frustrated. The business is like, what's going on? And the individual contributors, like, I don't know what I could be doing differently. So that leads to a sense of stress and burnout. And so those are other measures. We could evaluate how stressed people are. We could evaluate the morale. Those are things that, if the time blocking initiative is successful and people are being more productive, they have more clarity on their goals. Well, what do you imagine might happen? Now they feel better. The morale goes. That's another thing that we could potentially measure. Lastly, this one is super interesting. So in our meetup group, we unpack the behavior of time blocking. Now, on the one hand, when we need to operationalize, you'd think, okay, time blocking is literally the act of creating blocks on your calendar and then filling it in with, like, send my
Yeah.
emails or work on this important project or have a meeting with my supervisee, giving them constructive feedback project, whatever it is.
Yeah.
You'd think that that would be it. But actually, when we look at the behavior relative to the problem, we realize things like, well, just because somebody time blocks doesn't mean that they're going to follow what's in their calendar. That really, we need them to set themselves up for success to actually block their time. And that would be something like letting their supervisor know, hey, I'm going to color code in my calendar red. And that means like, please don't disturb me, and let their peers know, let anybody know that I'm using this system so that this is really important time. Do not disturb. I've even seen in one of my previous organizations, people would put like in a cubicle dynamic, they would put up ribbons that say, do not disturb. And so if you walked by somebody's cubicle and it said, do not disturb, the culture in our organization was to honor and respect. We would turn off all notifications. And in some cases, you might even need to go to a private space so that nobody just disrupts you. So while time blocking is the behavior, there's actually a few other things that need to be done to set people up for success in order to honor those time blocks. And so when we operationalize those behaviors, it's not just the behavior on its face. It's also, are people doing the things they need to do that might prevent the time blocking from actually being useful? So those would be things that we might operationalize. Then we train people on that. We, create the right support systems for people to actually be able to time block. And then we can measure some of those things. What did you do to set yourself up for success and time block? What were the things that continued to get in the way? And that gives us really useful feedback to ultimately improve on our goals. So I know that's a bit of a long answer, but I think it's this level of depth that's really helpful to figure out
Yeah.
not only how do we design a really appropriate learning intervention, but then how do we measure its effectiveness? And each one of those questions helps us to find useful metrics that aren't just satisfaction rates, completion rates, and things like that.
Absolutely. And absolutely love your, strategy of asking the right questions, because that is so important. My next question would be, are all training programs measurable? If not, what criteria should organizations use to determine if the training programs are eligible for impact measurement?
So I have another question for you to help us answer this question, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So, do you believe that all training initiatives have a goal or a
Yes.
purpose?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes. So, if we don't measure, then how do we know if we've accomplished our goals or our purpose for the initiative?
I mean, now measurement can be so many different things. You can measure a quantitative impact, or you can always do feedback collection and understand, is it really helping the audience like it was intended to be? So yeah, measurement I think is important, but yeah, how you do it is also equally important, and you have to ensure that it's fitting the situation well.
And that's exactly right. But whether you're asking open ended feedback, or you've got a psychometric assessment that you're evaluating, or if you're literally the fly on the wall observing people's behavior, depends, of course, on the goals and the outcomes that you desire. But every one of those things
Yeah.
is an example of measurement. And so I think one of the misperceptions, kind of going back to your first question, is that measurement is ROI. I think
Okay.
that perception that measurement is something so sophisticated as an ROI equation. It's not what we
Yeah.
mean by measurement. Measurement is any strategy or initiative that would help us get good data to know if we've accomplished our goals or not, or to get feedback on how can we improve our goals for the future. Those are measures. Those are
Yeah.
methods of, again, getting good data. So, but you're right.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things I wanted to say is there's not a one size fits all approach with measurement. Sometimes we just need a short survey. Sometimes we need something much more involved. Sometimes we need managers and supervisors and peers all involved to give a variety of perspectives on performance. But at the end of the day, that strategy and the amount of time and resources that we invest are all going to be correlated with the program. And so
Yeah.
sometimes, like compliance training, we don't necessarily need to have a robust evaluation in place,
Yeah.
but we just need to
Yes.
know, well, if we're doing this for compliance purposes, we need to know that people got the information or they completed the program, because that's all that legally we need to
Yes.
demonstrate. And
Yeah.
that's it. Like that's your measurement approach. And if you want to
Yeah.
collect more data, great, but you don't have to. So I think everything should be measured, but we don't measure equally. We measure in accordance with what are our goals, What are the outcomes that we see?
Yeah. And absolutely. And you don't want to overwhelm your learners with so much of, you know, measurement criteria for sure.
Yeah.
So a follow-up question, Elena, to my previous one, should all training programs be measured, or are there some L&D initiatives that can ignore effective outcome measurement? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I feel like we've sort of already answered this question. I think everything should be measured,
Yeah.
evaluated, and we need some kind of data point to tell us if we've moved in the right direction with regard to our goals. And so I think managing the resources that we have when we do the investments in measurement and even learning design, I think that we shouldn't be giving equal resources and time to all initiatives in their design
Yeah.
and delivery, but also in their measurement. And so if you're investing very little resources in a training initiative, then likely the same amount of resources proportionally would go into our measurement approach, which might just be one question or looking to one data point the organization already collects.
Exactly. So it's often said that organizations need to be data driven to measure the impact of their learning programs, right? What steps do you recommend for developing a data driven mindset? How do you access relevant data to measure program impact and the effectiveness of learning initiatives?
So, in its simplest form, being data driven means that we are able to make informed decisions with data. And so, in the process of becoming data driven, I would be doing a self assessment and I would ask myself, do I have the data I need to make important decisions? Or the reverse. When I make
Yeah.
important decisions, how do I make those decisions? And do I look to data or what do I do? And if people don't feel like data that they have access to is overly useful in the important decisions they're making, and that can be anything from how do I prioritize the initiatives that I'm working on in this organization? It could be
Yeah.
how do I improve the program that we just completed? Or it could be how do we figure out what initiative is necessary to solve a problem?
Yeah.
Whatever it is that you're doing in terms of making big decisions, we need evidence and data that helps us make sure we're making the right choices in what we invest in. And so if
Absolutely.
you're like, I don't really feel like my data is overly useful when I make these kinds of decisions, then you don't have the right data or the right systems, or the data is not accessible. And so, based upon your honest answer to the question, when I make important decisions, like where do I go? What do I turn to? Do I just talk to my supervisor? Or can I go to a certain dashboard or technology tool and make some queries to help me get some insights to make decisions maybe before I talk to my supervisor? So, if your data is convoluted and not useful, it's likely that you are not on the data driven side of the spectrum. And it's time to get really clear on what data would be useful and start building the systems just incrementally to get
Yeah.
access to that data or to create the data in the first place to then make those decisions. But ultimately, it's that decision making ability with data that helps us to understand if we're moving in the right direction to be data driven
Yeah.
or not.
Absolutely. And can you share some success stories where robust measurement strategy led to significant improvements in learning out? What contributed to these success?
So, one of my favorite stories, I actually talk about it in my book, among many other stories, is the program that was meant for training new managers because the new managers were insanely overwhelmed. And these folks were promoted internally and they were promoted because they were high performers. And all of us probably are familiar with this dynamic that high performers and people who really excel at some function in the organization are often promoted from within. And that's awesome. And we want more of internal promotions, of course. But that doesn't guarantee that those folks who are great at their jobs are going to be great at managing people. And so, in that context, we discovered that teaching people how to delegate was going to be a critical skill in helping them to
Yeah.
manage their teams. And
Yeah.
we got to that point because we heard anecdotally, going back to the problem and the change that we want to see, right? Those questions were part of our discovery process here. We heard that the problem was, again, the burnout, that they were working so many hours doing both the same individual contributor activities and now adding on these managerial responsibilities on top of that, that folks were working insane amounts of hours. And they were like, if I had known that I was going to be working this amount of hours, I would have never taken this manager job. But the truth of the matter is, they didn't know how to manage making that transition from helping other people do individual contributor work while they are now doing more strategic leadership level work. That transition is not always intuitive. And we believe that delegation and helping them prepare for delegation conversations, monitor delegation, even identify what could be delegated, that was all part of our program. So we developed a pilot program because we wanted to test if it was going to be useful or not to roll out to the whole organization. And we focused on, in the same like time blocking example where I pointed out, it's not just delegating things. It's like, how do we set people up for success in identifying what to delegate and then like giving people the right information when they delegate, and then also setting expectations for quality and then following up and supporting people. So delegation was sort of broken down into these different stages. It wasn't just this ambiguous thing. It was very clear operationally. When we say delegation, it's picking the things that are appropriate to delegate. But even before that, figuring out, when do I know if I should delegate or not? And so we were teaching people that when you have surpassed your stress, there's an average amount of stress that we all have at work, right?
Yeah.
Especially those who are in leadership positions. But when you go above and beyond that level of stress and you're doing that consistently, that's the indicator I need to be delegating something. I need to take something off my plate. And so helping new managers to figure that out for themselves was part of that process. So we did all these different activities and we gave them a great amount of practice. And in the end, the program was an incredible success, but not necessarily in the way that we imagined. So here are the things that were the outcomes for this program that I think make it a success. So one is that we built the measurement into the flow of learning. So the program was 4 weeks long, and every week we were focusing on a different piece of that overall delegation sort of process. And we
Mhm.
would do some not pre-work, but we would do a pre-assessment and we'd ask people. Actually, time blocking was one of those things that we included in the process. We'd ask people as a baseline to say, okay, what's your level of stress? Look at your calendar for the previous week and how would you rate your level of stress? Look at your calendar last week and tell us, how many hours did you work approximately? Look at your calendar last week and reflect on about what percent of the work did you do was individual contributor activities. And we defined that few examples so it was clear. And what amount or percent of your activities were more strategic, managerial, leadership work. And so we did that every single week, with the hypothesis being that over time, as people practiced more of those delegation components and they were delegating more things throughout the program, the hypothesis was that they would work less hours, they would be less stressed and feel more optimistic about their role, that they would have more clarity on what is a strategic priority activity and what is that individual contributor work I should be letting go of, and that the ratio of that strategic work versus individual contributor work would go to the way that we wanted it to, which is, of course, more strategic work, less individual contributor work. So we baked that in and we had time as a variable because we met twice a week over the 4 weeks. So we had multiple data points that helped us to see the change over time. And of course, we collected data on how people were completing the activities. And one of the other things that we did throughout the program was that we had a rubric where people could do a self-assessment, like, hey, in the last class, we asked you to do this. Go ahead and take a moment and evaluate how it went. And so it would be like
Yeah.
5 questions that said, from a scale of excellent to poor, and we didn't show them, but that was our measure of how you did these activities. And we could then look at that as a group and say, okay, as a group, you guys really excelled in this part. Tell us more about why that was so intuitive. And then the pieces of the activity that were not as great, tell us what got in the way. What was hard? What can we do to support you? And so not only were we evaluating how people were performing the pieces of the delegation process, but we could also give them personalized, timely feedback so that they could more quickly adapt and be ramped up to ultimately doing delegation more quickly and more intuitively after the initiative is over. And then lastly, this is where it gets interesting. So I told you the hypothesis, right? We would have people working less hours, feeling better, and working on more strategic activities. People work the same amount of hours. That was one of the things
Yes.
that didn't change. So
Yes.
over the period of time, people were working the same amount of hours. There was no significant difference. But what did change is that people felt better about their role. They were more optimistic. They had more clarity on what was a strategic thing for them to do, and it made it easier for them to delegate. And that was basically it. Those were our wins. We had more strategic work time happening over the course of the program, and more optimism, but the same number of working hours. And so that taught us a few things about, okay, what are some realistic expectations? What are some ways we could support people continually after the program to maybe work on getting more reasonable work hours? And ultimately, it gave us ways to prioritize how to improve the program so that we could eliminate the scrap learning and we could double down on the things that were really working. And we use participants' feedback to figure out in next edition program what was really helpful for them to build those delegation skills and get these out, and what might we decide to eliminate.
Absolutely. Alaina, what a truly enriching discussion this was. Told you the key to correct impact measurement from learning initiatives could be this nuanced and multifaceted. Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. To our listeners, stay tuned for more content like this, featuring incredible thought leaders like Alaina. We are available on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Whether you are at home or on the go, our podcast is your gateway to learn about the latest trend in L&D, HR, and tech. I'm your host, Akanksha, signing off.